Hands where I can see them." The command cut through the quiet like a snapped wire, sharp and sudden, echoing off the row of modest brick houses lining Maplewood Drive as porch lights flickered on one by one, curious shadows shifting behind curtains, and Alicia Carter froze mid-step, her hand still gripping the strap of her worn hospital bag, the faint scent of antiseptic clinging to her scrubs as the weight of a 12-hour ICU shift pressed into her shoulders, her body aching in that dull, familiar way that came from standing too long under fluorescent lights, saving lives that rarely knew her name. And now she stood just 10 feet from her own front door, the chipped blue paint she'd meant to fix for months catching the yellow glow of the street lamp above. Yet the man standing behind her police cruiser looked at her like she didn't belong there at all. Officer Daniel Brooks rested one hand casually on the roof of his car, posture loose but voice tight with authority, the kind that didn't ask questions because it didn't expect answers, his badge catching the light as he stepped forward half a pace, boots crunching softly against the gravel edge of the curb. "I said hands up," he repeated, slower this time, as if explaining something simple to someone who should already understand, and Alicia swallowed, her throat dry, not from fear exactly but from the exhaustion of having to prove something that should have been obvious. This was her street, her home, her space, the place where she paid a mortgage every month, where she planted tulips that never quite bloomed right, where she waved to neighbors on Sunday mornings. Yet right now none of that seemed to matter. Her fingers slowly lifted, not high, just enough to show compliance without surrender, her pulse steadying as she forced herself to breathe through her nose, in and out, the way she did when a patient's monitor started beeping too fast. Control the moment. Don't let it control you. Across the street, a porch screen creaked. Open just an inch, someone watching but not stepping out, the air thick with that particular kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting, like the moment before a storm decides whether to break. Alicia's voice came out softer than she expected but clear, grounded. "This is my house," she said, not defensive, not pleading, just stating a fact. And for a split second something flickered across Brooks' face, not doubt exactly, but irritation, like the answer didn't fit the version of reality he had already decided on. His gaze swept over her scrubs, her car parked along the curb, the porch light she had left on that morning before leaving for work, and still he didn't lower his stance, step away from the vehicle. He replied, ignoring her words entirely, the distance between them feeling longer than the width of the street, heavier than the humid Georgia air settling into the pavement. Alicia shifted her weight slightly, the gravel pressing through the thin soles of her sneakers, every instinct telling her to de-escalate, to comply, to just get inside and close the door, but something steadier, deeper, held her in place, not defiance, not anger, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew the truth didn't need to be raised to be real. Somewhere down the block a dog barked once, then stopped, as if sensing the tension threading through the night, and just beyond the reach of the streetlight, where the shadows thickened near the oak tree at the corner, a figure stood still, barely noticeable, hoodie blending into the darkness, a leash held loosely in one hand, the faint outline of a German shepherd at his side, ears alert, body calm, watching, waiting, unseen by the officer whose voice continued to fill the space, but not unheard by the man who had learned long ago how to recognize the exact moment when a situation was about to tip from ordinary into something that could not be taken back. Alicia held her hands steady, not raised high in surrender, but visible enough to remove any excuse, her fingers slightly trembling from fatigue rather than fear as the fabric of her light blue scrubs rustled softly in the humid night air, and for a moment the only sound was the low hum of the cruiser's engine idling at the curb, its headlights cutting a pale white line across her driveway, illuminating the familiar cracks in the concrete she had memorized over years of coming home after long shifts. Each step usually a quiet return to safety, but now stretched into something unfamiliar, something watched. Officer Brooks shifted his stance again, one foot angling outward as if anchoring himself to the moment, his eyes scanning her face not with curiosity, but with expectation, as though waiting for her to slip into a role he already believed she belonged to. "You matching a description," he said finally, the words delivered flat, practiced, but lacking detail, and Alicia felt a small, steady pressure rise in her chest. Not panic, not anger, just the weight of being placed inside a story she had not written. Her gaze moved briefly past him toward the quiet line of houses. Mrs. Green's porch light now fully on, the silhouette of her neighbor barely visible behind the curtain, unmoving, watching but not intervening. The distance between people measured not in feet but in hesitation. Alicia inhaled slowly, the scent of night air mixing with the sterile memory of hospital corridors still clinging to her senses. And when she spoke again, her voice remained even, controlled. "Then you should have the right address," she said, not sharp, not defiant, just clear, grounded in fact. Brooks exhaled through his nose, a subtle sign of impatience, his hand brushing lightly against the side of his radio, as if considering calling something in but deciding against it. "Step away from the car and keep your hands where I can see them," he repeated. This time slower, each word spaced as though repetition alone could create authority. Alicia shifted her weight again, her shoulder bag sliding slightly down her arm, the strap digging into her skin from hours of wear, and she carefully moved it forward with one hand, deliberate, visible, every motion calculated to avoid misinterpretation. The porch light above her door flickered once, then steadied, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the cold white beam from the cruiser, dividing the space into two worlds, one belonging, one questioning, and she stood exactly between them. "I just got off a 12-hour shift," she said quietly, not as an excuse but as context, as reality, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent the day holding strangers together while their families waited outside closed doors. Brooks did not respond to that, his expression unchanged, his focus fixed on control rather than understanding. And somewhere behind the line of trees, just beyond where the streetlight faded into shadow, the man with the hood remained still, his posture relaxed but attentive, the leash in his hand loose. The German shepherd at his side silent except for a low, steady breath, the animal's ears angled forward, tracking tone, tension, intent, the way it had been trained to do in places far more dangerous than this quiet suburban street. The man's gaze never left the scene, not out of curiosity but recognition. He had seen this kind of moment before, the precise second when words stopped being about information and started being about power. Alicia's hands lowered slightly, still visible, still calm, her shoulders straightening just enough to reclaim a piece of space that had been taken from her without permission. "Officer," she said, the word measured, respectful but firm. "This is my home." And this time she did not look away, her eyes meeting his directly, not challenging, not aggressive, just present, unmovable in a way that did not rely on volume or force, and for a fraction of a second the night seemed to hold its breath. The distant hum of a passing car fading at the end of the block, the leaves of the oak tree barely stirring in a faint breeze, the unseen observer in the shadows shifting his stance just slightly, weight transferring from one foot to the other, not stepping forward yet, not intervening, but no longer entirely still, because something in the air had changed, something subtle but undeniable, the moment stretching thin, balanced between escalation and something else, something quieter, something waiting to be revealed. Officer Brooks' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the small muscle near his temple pulsing once as Alicia's steady gaze held, not challenging but unmoving, and that seemed to unsettle him more than any raised voice could have, because there was nothing in her posture that fit the script he had expected, no sudden movement, no nervous stumble, just quiet certainty standing under a porch light that had been hers long before he stepped onto the curb. He shifted again, this time adjusting his stance as if recalibrating, his radio crackling faintly at his shoulder but still ignored, the weight of his authority hanging in the air without confirmation. "Ma'am," he said, the word clipped, formal, but lacking warmth. "I am going to need you to comply so we can clear this up." And Alicia felt the phrasing land, not as a request, but as a narrowing of options, the kind that pretended to offer resolution while quietly removing control. Her fingers flexed once at her sides, a subtle release of tension, her body remembering the countless times she had guided patients through fear by lowering her own voice, slowing her own breath, grounding the moment in something real. "I am standing still," she replied, calm and measured, her tone the same one she used when a monitor alarm would spike. and families would look to her for answers. "I am not going anywhere." And the words settled into the space between them, not loud, but firm enough to be heard. Across the street, a curtain shifted slightly wider, a second silhouette appearing beside the first, whispers barely audible through the glass. The neighborhood waking in fragments, not with noise but with attention, the quiet awareness that something was not right. Brooks glanced briefly toward the houses, then back at Alicia, as if recalculating who his audience was. His hand moved again near his belt, not reaching, just hovering, a habitual gesture of control. "We had a call," he said, this time offering a sliver of explanation, though still incomplete. "Suspicious vehicle parked for an extended period," and Alicia's eyes flicked once toward her car, the same one she had parked in the exact spot every night for the past 3 years. The same dent near the rear bumper from a grocery cart that had rolled too far on a windy afternoon. The same windshield she had wiped down that morning before leaving for work. Ordinary details now being reframed into something else entirely. She let out a quiet breath, not a sigh, just air, leaving her lungs as she chose her next words carefully. "That is my car," she said, simple, factual, and then after a brief pause, "I live here." And the repetition was not for him alone, but for the moment itself, anchoring it back to truth. Brooks did not respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing whether to escalate or redirect, the silence stretching again, longer this time, heavier. And in that silence the faint sound of a chain shifting could be heard from the edge of the block, almost too soft to notice, but not to the trained ear of the man standing in the shadows. Marcus Reed adjusted his grip on the leash by a fraction, his thumb brushing against the worn fabric loop, a habit formed over years of grounding himself in small, controlled movements. Rex remained still beside him, the dog's posture relaxed but alert, muscles ready without tension, eyes fixed not on Alicia but on the officer, reading tone, stance, energy, the invisible language that dictated when calm could turn into something else. Marcus' gaze followed the exchange with quiet precision, noting every detail, the cadence of Brooks' voice, the deliberate stillness of Alicia's hands, the distance between them measured not just in feet but in intent. He had seen this pattern before, in different places, under different conditions, but the structure was always the same. A situation that could resolve quietly or spiral depending on a single decision, and right now that decision hovered just out of reach. Alicia shifted her stance slightly, one foot moving half an inch to ease the pressure in her arch, a small human adjustment that in another context would have meant nothing, but here felt amplified, observed, interpreted. She kept her hands visible, her shoulders squared but not rigid, her expression composed, not blank but present, and she spoke again, softer this time, but no less clear. "If there is a concern, you can check my address," she said, offering resolution without surrender, a path forward that did not require her to step out of her own space. Brooks' eyes flicked toward the house, the porch light, the numbers near the doorframe, then back to her, the hesitation. Brief, but noticeable. And for the first time since the encounter began, the certainty in his posture wavered, not enough to change his stance, but enough to register. And in the quiet that followed, the night seemed to lean in, waiting, the unseen presence at the corner no longer entirely separate from the moment, but not yet part of it either, a line about to be crossed, though no one had moved to cross it yet. The numbers on the doorframe caught the edge of the cruiser's headlights, white against chipped blue paint, and for a brief second Officer Brooks actually looked at them, not as a formality, but as something that might confirm or contradict the version of events he had already committed to, his eyes moving from the digits to Alicia's face and back again, the hesitation subtle but real, like a crack forming in something rigid. Alicia did not move to fill the silence. She did not rush to explain or justify. She simply stood there with her hands still visible, shoulders steady, letting the truth exist without decoration. The porch light above her flickered once more as a moth circled it, tapping softly against the glass, a small, ordinary sound that somehow made the moment feel sharper, more grounded. Across the street the second silhouette shifted again, the faint outline of a phone now visible near the window, held low, recording or ready to, the quiet audience growing without. Stepping forward, Brooks cleared his throat, the sound dry, controlled, and finally reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, pressing the button with a firm, practiced motion. "Dispatch, can you confirm a call on Maplewood Drive?" he said, voice even but slightly tighter than before. The response came back after a short burst of static, a voice calm and distant, listing a report that had been vague from the start. A vehicle, a concern, no specific threat, no confirmed issue, just enough to justify attention, not enough to sustain certainty. Brooks listened, his gaze drifting again toward the house, the car, the woman standing in front of him who had not changed position since the encounter began, and when he released the radio, the weight of the moment shifted, not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but in the quiet recalibration of someone who realized the ground beneath their authority was not as solid as they had assumed. Alicia felt it too, not as victory, not as relief, but as a subtle loosening in the air, like a knot that had been pulled too tight beginning to ease. She lowered her hands just an inch more, still visible, still calm, reclaiming space in small, deliberate increments. "You can verify the address," she said again, her voice softer now, but carrying the same clarity, offering the same path forward without stepping out of her own boundary. Brooks exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping by a fraction, the tension in his stance no longer as rigid, though not fully gone. He took a step back, not retreating but repositioning, creating a few extra inches of distance that had not been there before, and in that movement something unspoken passed between them, a shift from confrontation towards something more uncertain, more human. The night air seemed to settle around them, the distant hum of a passing car fading as it turned onto the next block, and at the edge of the shadows, Marcus Reed took one quiet step forward, just enough for the streetlight to catch the outline of his shoe. The movement so controlled it barely registered, but Rex noticed, the dog's head tilting slightly, ears forward, not tense, just aware. Marcus did not speak, not yet. His presence still more suggestion than interruption, but closer now. Closer to the line that separated observer from participant. Alicia's eyes flicked briefly toward the movement, not turning her head fully, just enough to register that something had shifted in the periphery, a figure where there had been only shadow before, and for a moment the scene expanded beyond the two of them, the quiet street, the watching neighbors, the unseen witness stepping slowly into light. Brooks followed her gaze instinctively, his own head turning slightly toward the corner, his focus breaking just long enough to acknowledge that the moment was no longer contained, that there were eyes beyond his own, perspectives beyond his control, and when he looked back at Alicia, the certainty that had defined his first command was no longer absolute. It had thinned, stretched, leaving space for something else to enter, something that had been there all along but was only now becoming visible. The shift in Officer Brooks' posture did not go unnoticed, not by Alicia, not by the quiet eyes watching from behind drawn curtains, and certainly not by the man who now stood just within the edge of the streetlight, where shadow gave way to shape. Marcus Reed did not rush, did not call out. He simply stepped forward one measured pace at a time, the soft scrape of his shoe against the pavement barely audible, yet somehow cutting through the tension more effectively than any raised voice could have. Rex moved with him in perfect sync, the leash loose, the dog's gait smooth and controlled, a presence that did not threaten but did not retreat either. And for the first time since the encounter began, the space felt different, not smaller, not larger, just shared in a way that had not existed before. Brooks' attention shifted fully now, his body turning slightly toward the movement, instinct guiding his eyes before thought could catch up. "Evening," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, not loud, not confrontational, just present, the kind of tone that carried weight without needing volume. Alicia's gaze followed the sound, her eyes settling briefly on the man and the dog, taking in the details without reacting, recognizing something in the calm that mirrored her own. Brooks straightened a fraction, his stance adjusting as he registered the new variable. "Sir, I am handling a situation," he replied. The words measured but edged with the need to reassert control. Marcus nodded, once, acknowledging without yielding, his eyes moving from Brooks to Alicia and back again, taking in the full picture before speaking further. "I can see that," he said, and then after a slight pause, "I also saw how it started." The sentence hung there, simple, unembellished, but heavy with implication. Brooks' expression tightened again, the earlier hesitation replaced by something sharper, more defensive. "This does not concern you," he said, his voice firmer now, but the certainty from before did not fully return. It flickered instead, like a light struggling to stay steady. Marcus did not move closer, did not invade the space. He simply stood where he was, the leash still loose in his hand, Rex sitting calmly at his side now, eyes alert but quiet. "It concerns the truth," Marcus replied, the words not raised, not forced, just placed into the moment with precision. Alicia felt the air shift again, not toward escalation but toward exposure, as if something that had been building beneath the surface was finally beginning to show itself. She lowered her hands another inch, still visible, still composed, reclaiming more of herself with each measured movement. Brooks glanced briefly at the neighbor's windows, at the faint glow of phones now unmistakable, and then back at Marcus, the awareness of being seen settling into his posture in a way that could not be ignored. "You are interfering," he said, but the statement lacked the authority it aimed to carry. Marcus shook his head slightly, a small, almost patient gesture. "No," he said, "I am observing." And then after a beat, just like them, his gaze flicked briefly toward the houses, acknowledging the quiet audience without calling them out. Brooks' jaw tightened again, his hand hovering near his radio, as if considering his next move, the options narrowing not because he had been challenged loudly, but because the moment had expanded beyond his control. Alicia spoke then, her voice calm, steady, threading through the space without urgency. "I have answered your questions," she said, not as a challenge, not as a plea, just a statement of completion. Brooks looked at her, then at Marcus, then at the house behind her, the porch light casting its steady warmth against the scene, and for a long second no one moved, no one spoke, the night holding them all in a fragile balance, the kind that could tip in any direction but now leaned toward something quieter, something inevitable. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply anchoring himself in place, his presence no longer hidden, no longer peripheral, but fully part of the moment. And in that presence there was no aggression, no demand, only clarity, the kind that did not need to be forced because it could not be ignored. Brooks exhaled slowly, the sound audible in the stillness, his shoulders dropping another fraction as the realization settled in that this situation was no longer defined by his initial assumption. The ground beneath it had changed, and he could either adjust or continue standing on something that was no longer there. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, layered with breath, with light, with the faint hum of electricity running through the street lamp above them. Alicia stood still in that space, her hands now lowered naturally at her sides, but still open, visible, her shoulders no longer carrying the same rigid tension from moments before. The shift was subtle but real, like someone stepping out of a storm without realizing the rain had stopped. Officer Brooks remained where he was, but something in his stance had changed, not just physically but internally. The certainty that had once driven his voice now replaced with a quiet recalculation he could not quite hide. Marcus did not speak again. He did not need to. His presence had already done what words could not. It had widened the moment, made it impossible to reduce Alicia into something smaller than she was. Rex sat calmly beside him, chest rising and falling in slow, even rhythm, the leash still loose, a symbol of control that did not need to be tightened. A breeze moved through the oak tree at the corner, leaves whispering softly, and the sound seemed to carry across the street, brushing against the windows where neighbors still watched, their silhouettes now clearer, no longer pretending not to see. Alicia's eyes lifted slightly toward her porch, toward the warm glow that had been waiting for her since she left before sunrise. That simple light now feeling like something earned again, not taken. She let out a slow breath, her body remembering what it felt like to simply stand without being questioned, without being measured against suspicion. "Is there anything else you need from me, officer?" she asked, her voice calm, not sharp, not tired, just steady, the kind of steady that came from knowing you had already done everything required. Brooks looked at her, then at Marcus, then briefly at the houses again, and for a long second he said nothing. His hand dropped fully from his radio, the gesture small but final, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that something inside him had shifted, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to change the direction of the moment. "No," he said finally, the word quieter than any he had spoken before. Lacking the command that had defined his first words, Alicia nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, not triumph, not relief, just closure. She turned slightly toward her door, not rushing, not hesitating, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Each step across the driveway measured in a way that reclaimed the space beneath her feet. The porch light grew brighter as she approached, casting her shadow long behind her, stretching across the ground toward the cruiser, toward the officer who now stood still, watching without speaking. Marcus remained where he was, his gaze following her movement for a moment before lowering slightly, not out of submission but out of respect for the quiet ending that was taking place. Rex shifted once, standing now, ready to move, but waiting for the signal that had not yet been given. Alicia reached the steps, her hand brushing lightly against the railing she had painted herself 2 summers ago. The memory of that afternoon flickering through her mind. The heat, the quiet satisfaction of making something her own. She paused at the door for just a second, not turning back, not needing to. The moment behind her already settling into something complete. She opened the door, and warm light spilled out onto the porch, soft and steady, a contrast to the harsh white glare that had filled the space minutes before. And as she stepped inside, the door closing gently behind her, the street seemed to exhale, the tension dissolving into the night air. Brooks stood there a moment longer, his posture no longer rigid, no longer fixed, just a man in a uniform under a streetlight, the edges of authority softened by something quieter, something harder to define. Marcus finally shifted, a small movement, a step backward into the shadow he had come from. Rex turning with him without needing instruction, their silhouettes blending again with the darkness at the edge of the block, not disappearing, just receding, leaving behind a space that felt different now, not because something loud had happened, but because something quiet had been seen, understood, and allowed to end without force. The door clicked shut behind Alicia with a soft, final sound that seemed to settle deeper than the wood itself, and for a moment the porch remained lit, the warm glow spilling across the steps and into the driveway like something that refused to be taken back. Inside the house a faint shadow moved past the window, slow, steady, the rhythm of someone returning to a space that belonged to her, not claimed, not defended, just lived in. Outside the air felt cooler now, or maybe just quieter. Officer Brooks stood where he was, his cruiser idling behind him, the red and blue lights still off, the scene stripped down to its simplest form. No urgency, no threat, just a street, a house, and a man left with the echo of his own assumptions. He looked at the closed door for a second longer than necessary, his gaze lingering on the number beside it, as if committing it to memory in a different way this time, not as a target, but as a correction. His shoulders lowered slowly, the tension that had defined his posture unwinding in increments too small to measure, but too clear to ignore. Across the street the curtain shifted again, then slowly closed, one silhouette disappearing, then another, the quiet witnesses retreating back into their own lives now that the moment no longer demanded their attention. The glow of phone screens dimmed and vanished, leaving only the steady streetlight and the hum of the night. Brooks reached up and adjusted his radio, not calling anything in, just touching it, a reflex searching for something to anchor to. But there was nothing to report that had not already been resolved in silence. He took a breath, deeper this time, and turned slightly toward the cruiser, but did not move to get in just yet, as if something inside him needed a second longer to catch up to what had just unfolded. At the edge of the block Marcus Reed stepped back fully into the shadow, his outline fading as the light released him. Rex moved with him without a sound, the dog's presence just as controlled in departure as it had been in arrival. Marcus paused for a brief moment, his gaze lifting toward the house one last time, not checking, not questioning, just acknowledging. The kind of acknowledgement that did not need to be seen to be real. Then he turned, his footsteps quiet against the pavement as he moved down the sidewalk, away from the streetlight, away from the moment, carrying nothing with him except the certainty that he had been there when it mattered. Brooks finally moved, opening the door of his cruiser with a low mechanical click, the interior light flickering on and casting a pale glow across his uniform. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before sitting down, his hand resting on the steering wheel without starting the car. The engine already running but the motion not yet following. His eyes drifted once more toward the house, the porch light still on, steady, unchanged, and something about that steadiness lingered, not as a lesson spoken out loud, but as something quieter, something that would not leave as easily as the moment itself. He shifted his grip, exhaled slowly, and finally placed the car into drive. The cruiser rolling forward at a controlled pace, tires humming softly against the asphalt as he moved down Maplewood Drive, not in a rush, not with urgency, just leaving, the street behind him returning to its ordinary rhythm, the oak tree rustling gently, the porch lights dimming one by one, and inside the house Alicia leaned lightly against the closed door for a brief second, her eyes closing as she let the last of the tension leave her shoulders, not in relief, not in exhaustion, but in quiet release. Then she straightened, set her bag down on the small table by the entryway, and moved deeper into the house, the warm light following her, the night outside settling back into silence as if nothing had happened at all, except that something had, something small and quiet and undeniable, something that did not need to be spoken to exist. The street returned to stillness and layers, not all at once, but piece by piece, like a breath slowly released, the hum of the cruiser fading into the distance as its taillights disappeared beyond the bend at the end of Maplewood Drive, leaving behind nothing but the steady glow of street lamps and the quiet rhythm of a neighborhood settling back into itself. Inside her home, Alicia moved through the familiar space with unhurried steps, the soft creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet grounding her in something real, something unchanged. She set her hospital bag on the kitchen counter, the faint clink of her keys following as she placed them beside it, her hands pausing there for a moment, fingers resting against the cool surface as if confirming that everything was still exactly where it belonged. The overhead light cast a gentle warmth across the room, catching the edges of framed photos on the wall, small pieces of a life built over time, not questioned, not interrupted, just lived. She reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair back behind her ear, her reflection briefly visible in the dark window above the sink, her eyes steady, tired but clear, not carrying fear, only the quiet weight of what had just passed. Outside, the oak tree shifted again, its leaves whispering softly as the breeze moved through them, and at the far end of the block Marcus Reed slowed his pace, his footsteps measured, not in a hurry to leave. Rex walked beside him with the same calm precision, the leash still slack, the dog's head lifting slightly as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. Marcus glanced once over his shoulder, not toward the street itself, but toward the idea of it, toward the place where something small had been corrected without needing to be forced. His gaze lingered for a second before he turned forward again, continuing down the sidewalk until the light no longer reached him, blending once more into the quiet anonymity of the night. Back inside, Alicia exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping fully now as the last trace of tension left her body. She moved to the sink and turned the faucet on, the sound of running water filling the room. Simple, steady, a contrast to the silence that had held so much weight just minutes before. She washed her hands out of habit more than necessity, the cool water running over her fingers, grounding her further, reminding her of all the moments in the hospital where control meant calm, where presence meant everything, and she carried that same presence now into her own space, not as defense, but as truth. She turned the faucet off and dried her hands, her movements unhurried, deliberate, reclaiming each second as her own. In the living room, the clock on the wall ticked softly, marking time in a way that felt different now, not stretched, not heavy, just moving forward. Alicia walked past it and toward the hallway, the light from the kitchen trailing behind her before she reached back and switched it off, the room dimming into a soft shadow that felt safe rather than uncertain. Outside, the street remained quiet, the last porch light across the road flicking off as one of the neighbors finally stepped away from the window, the world returning to its ordinary shape, yet holding within it the memory of something that had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to stay. And somewhere in that quiet, in the space between what had happened and what would come next, there was a sense of balance restored, not by force, not by confrontation, but by something steadier, something that did not need to raise its voice. To be heard, something that remained long after the moment itself had passed. The house settled into silence the way it always did after midnight. Not heavy, not empty, just still, the kind of stillness that held everything in place without needing to prove it. Alicia moved through the hallway with quiet steps, her hand brushing lightly against the wall as she passed. A familiar gesture, grounding. She paused briefly at the small table near the living room where a framed photo stood, the image catching a faint reflection from the streetlight outside, her younger self, smiling beside her mother on a summer afternoon, sunlight frozen in time. A reminder that some things remained steady no matter how the world shifted around them. She adjusted the frame slightly, not because it needed it, but because the action itself felt like a way of reclaiming order. Then she continued down the hall, the soft fabric of her scrubs moving with her, the exhaustion of the day finally beginning to settle into her muscles now that the tension had released. In the distance, a car passed slowly along the main road, its sound faint, almost distant enough to disappear completely. Outside, the street remained calm, the oak tree standing unmoved beneath the glow of the street lamp, its branches casting long shadows across the pavement that no longer felt sharp or uncertain, just part of the landscape again. Further down the block, Marcus Reed reached the corner where the sidewalk curved toward the next street. He slowed for a moment, his hand resting lightly against Rex's collar as the dog paused beside him, both of them still. Not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Marcus looked ahead, then briefly back. Over his shoulder, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging that something had concluded behind him, something that did not need to follow him any further. Rex shifted slightly, his posture relaxed, the quiet alertness easing now that the moment had passed. Marcus gave a small nod, almost to himself, and continued walking, his figure gradually fading into the darker stretch of the street where the lights were spaced farther apart, where presence became suggestion and then memory. Inside the house, Alicia reached her bedroom door and paused for a second, her hand resting on the handle, her eyes closing briefly as she took one final breath, deep and steady, not holding on to anything, not pushing anything away, just letting the night exist as it was. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room dim except for a small lamp on the bedside table, casting a soft amber glow across the space. She set her phone down, removed her shoes, and sat at the edge of the bed for a moment, her posture relaxed, her shoulders no longer carrying the weight of explanation or defense, just the natural fatigue of a long day. She leaned back slowly, the mattress giving beneath her as she lay down, her eyes tracing the faint patterns of light on the ceiling, the quiet hum of the house settling around her. Outside, the last porch light across the street flicked off, leaving only the steady street lamp and the endless stretch of night. The world continuing in its quiet rhythm, unchanged on the surface yet altered in something deeper, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And as Alicia's breathing slowed, her body finally releasing into rest, the moment that had unfolded outside her door dissolved into the larger flow of her life, not erased, not forgotten, but placed where it belonged. A reminder that presence could hold its ground without force, that truth could remain steady without being raised, and that sometimes the most powerful shift was the one that